Do you know the story of the enslaved cook from La Fortaleza in Puerto Rico, who risked her life to save others by giving food through a window? Ana, the cook of La Fortaleza in the year 1670, was a silenced voice of colonial San Juan. She was an enslaved woman about 36 years old who lived in 17th century Puerto Rico. Her existence emerges from the margins of a judicial record preserved in the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, Spain, corresponding to a legal case initiated in 1675. It mentions accusations against 3 Spanish soldiers from the San Juan garrison: Pedro González, Cristobal Fontanilla, and Francisco de Vitoria. The document does not present Ana as the main figure, but rather as an incidental witness, an everyday figure within the fortified space of the governor's residence in Puerto Rico, known as La Fortaleza. In 1670, Puerto Rico, under Spanish rule, slavery was a fundamental pillar of the colonial system. The trafficking of African people sustained the economy and the domestic structure of Spanish families in Puerto Rico. Enslaved women like Ana were assigned to domestic tasks in the households of high-ranking officials. Enslaved women served as cooks, laundresses, maids, or caretakers. La Fortaleza, originally built as a defensive fort in 1533 and expanded in the following decades, served both as a military stronghold and as the residence and administrative center of the governor. In that hierarchical and closely monitored environment, the enslaved carried out the essential tasks of daily life, preparing food, cleaning and carrying water, caring for the children, and maintaining the operation of the colonial seat of power. Ana was an enslaved woman who belonged to Governor Jerónimo de Velasco, who held the position between 1669 and 1670. Her role as the chief cook was crucial. She was responsible for feeding the governor, the officers, and probably the soldiers as well. Her age suggests that she was brought to the island in her youth, possibly as part of the transatlantic trade from West Africa, although the documents do not specify her origin. At a time when enslaved women were valued for their skill in the kitchen, Ana would have worked with spices, salted meats, and local products such as cassava and plantains, adapting African recipes to the limitations of the colonial pantry. One morning, Ana went to the pantry of La Fortaleza in search of spices to prepare the meal, something common in her work. However, at that moment, she witnessed something involving 3 soldiers from the garrison. Subsequently, the men were accused of behaviors considered serious and sexually illicit by the religious authorities of the time, crimes punished with severe penalties. Having witnessed what happened, Ana was called to testify, which placed her in a dangerous situation. In the Spanish colonial system, the word of an enslaved person had no legal value and was only accepted if it was verified through judicial torment, in other words, torture, a method used as an instrument of social and racial control rather than a pursuit of justice. The procedure began with taking the testimony. The scribe would ask if she maintained her statement, and if she did, she was warned that she would be subjected to the physical torture used for verification. She was then prepared for the torment, tied to a wooden device, while the ropes that bound her limbs were tightened. Each turn was recorded as half a turn, 1 turn, 2 turns, and so on. If the person endured without changing their statement, it was considered that they spoke truthfully and without deceit. Although in theory this punishment was not supposed to cause death and was meant to be carried out under supervision, in practice it was used to impose obedience and fear. In Ana's case, the record states that she received 4.5 turns, and that despite the pain, she maintained her statement, something that, in the judicial mindset of the 17th century, was considered proof of sincerity. However, that supposed verification granted her neither freedom nor recognition. Her testimony was used to support the case, not to acknowledge her humanity. Thus, the voices of enslaved people reached the archives through violence, caught between the rack and the scribe's pen. For this reason, modern historians speak of archives of pain, where each statement not only informs, but also exposes the institutional dehumanization of the colonial system. The judicial process continued until 1675, but after the verification of her testimony, No record of Anna's fate was preserved. It is likely that she did not survive the after effects, or that she died in imprisonment, nor are there any records of descendants or further biographical details. It is possible that she was buried in the slave cemetery next to the Church of San Jose, or in the surroundings of La Fortaleza, where servants and people of lower castes were buried without formal record. Even so, her name remains in Puerto Rico's archives, rescuing her from anonymity and turning her into a symbol of resilience and humanity. At a time when the simple act of feeding the poor through the kitchen window of La Fortaleza could cost her life, giving food through a window was an act of moral and political resistance. Anna broke, even if only for a few years, the ruling power's control over food in the colonial system. In a time when Puerto Ricans and enslaved people lived in misery and hunger under Spanish rule, her quiet, everyday action defied racial and social hierarchies. It was a form of subversive solidarity, an act of care toward others whom the system sought to keep subjugated. In a world that reduced her to property, Anna chose to act as a free person. She gave, spoke, resisted, and cared, even at the cost of her own safety. Her story carries a profound symbolic dimension. In a time when Black people were treated as property and kitchens were spaces of servitude, Anna transformed that space into a place of humanity. From a stone window in La Fortaleza, the ultimate symbol of colonial power, an enslaved woman gave life to others amid hunger and oppression. That image holds a powerful lesson about silent resistance, dignity, and courage. Today, we should remember Anna as one of the first documented women to challenge Spanish colonial power from within the very heart of the government. Her story, though fragmentary, represents thousands of Puerto Rican people who resisted through everyday acts of compassion and courage. Without weapons or speeches, but with a moral strength that transcended the centuries. Anna embodies three dimensions of legacy. First, that of human courage, because in a world that treated her as an object, she acted with conscience and humanity. Second, that of the testimony of enslaved women whose voices rarely survived. Her words, forced through torture, remain today a truth that illuminates the past. Third, that of the political act hidden in everyday life, showing that resistance can also exist in small gestures, in daily work, and in the care of others. That is why we must remember her not only as Ana, the enslaved cook of La Fortaleza, but as Anna, the one who spoke when silence was the law, the one who fed others when sharing was a crime, the one who resisted when pain was the law. Her name deserves to stand among the heroes and martyrs, because without women like her, silent, steadfast, and unseen, yet with the courage and empathy to care for others, there would have been no possible future for Puerto Rico. Remembering her is an act of historical justice for the brave women of Puerto Rico. Naming her is to restore the humanity that the archive tried to erase. If you like this story, follow us and give it a like. Don't miss our upcoming stories about the forgotten voices of Puerto Rico. See you next time.